Something unusual is unfolding along the border between the United States and Canada, and it's centered around a bridge that has suddenly become one of the most politically sensitive pieces of infrastructure in North America. If you look at satellite images of Detroit and Windsor today, two crossings stand out. The first is the aging Ambassador Bridge, a privately owned structure that has carried massive volumes of trade for decades, but struggles with congestion and limited capacity. The second is the newly built Gordie Howe International Bridge, an enormous modern crossing designed to transform trade between the two countries. The new bridge, built at a cost of more than 4 billion Canadian dollars, was meant to open soon and significantly expand cross-border transportation capacity. But a political dispute has turned that opening into a major diplomatic standoff. A few days ago, former President Donald Trump publicly suggested that the United States might delay staffing the American customs facilities connected to the bridge unless Canada agreed to certain demands regarding trade and ownership arrangements. The proposal immediately triggered controversy because the Gordie Howe Bridge was largely financed by Canada. Under agreements negotiated years earlier, Canada funded most of the construction, including parts of the infrastructure on the U.S. side, while Michigan still retains joint ownership of the crossing. Critics in both countries quickly pointed out that the arrangement already gives the United States significant benefits without requiring large financial contributions. The debate escalated quickly. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney responded calmly but firmly, stating that Canada fully intends to proceed with opening the bridge as planned. Rather than responding with heated rhetoric, his government signaled that it was reviewing broader economic and energy relationships connected to the cross-border trade system. That statement might have sounded routine, but analysts immediately recognized the potential leverage behind it. To understand why, you need to look at how tightly the economies of the United States and Canada are connected, especially in the Great Lakes region. The Detroit-Windsor corridor is one of the busiest trade routes in the world. Nearly a third of all goods traded between the two countries passes through this area. Hundreds of millions of dollars in products move across the border there every single day. The automotive industry depends heavily on this corridor. Parts for vehicles often cross the border multiple times before a car is finally assembled. A transmission component, for example, might start in Ontario, move to Michigan for processing, return to Canada for additional manufacturing, and then cross back again before the final vehicle is completed. Because of this system, even small disruptions in border traffic can have massive economic consequences. Manufacturing plants rely on just-in-time supply chains that require components to arrive exactly when they're needed. If a crossing becomes unreliable, assembly lines can slow down or stop entirely. That's why the Gordie Howe Bridge was considered such an important project. It would add major capacity, reduce congestion, and make the flow of goods more resilient. But the political controversy surrounding the bridge has now introduced uncertainty into that system. Another element of the dispute involves the older Ambassador Bridge, which is owned by a private family that has long profited from toll revenue generated by cross-border traffic. Because the new Gordie Howe Bridge will create competition and divert traffic away from the older crossing, some observers believe business interests connected to the existing bridge may prefer delays or restrictions on the new project. There have been reports of lobbying efforts in Washington related to international bridge policy, though investigations into those claims are still ongoing and no definitive conclusions have been reached. Regardless of the motivations behind the dispute, the situation highlights how economic infrastructure can become entangled with politics, and that's where energy enters the picture. Shortly after tensions rose over the bridge, Canada indicated it was reviewing several energy infrastructure corridors connected to the Great Lakes region. At first glance, the wording sounded technical and vague, but experts quickly understood the reference: pipelines and energy routes that deliver oil and fuel across the border. One of the most important of these is Line 5, a pipeline that transports large volumes of crude oil and natural gas liquids from the United States through Michigan and into refineries in Ontario. The pipeline has been controversial for environmental reasons for years, but it also plays a major role in supplying energy throughout the region. Fuel transported through that system eventually supports refineries and distribution networks that supply gasoline, jet fuel, and heating fuel across parts of the Midwest. Because of this, any uncertainty about energy infrastructure can immediately affect markets. After Canada mentioned reviewing these corridors, financial markets reacted quickly. Traders began analyzing what the move might mean for energy supplies in the Great Lakes region. Meanwhile, futures prices for certain fuels briefly increased as investors tried to assess potential risks. None of this means that energy supplies will be disrupted, but it demonstrates how interconnected the economic systems of the two countries really are. This is why the bridge dispute matters far beyond a single construction project. For people in Michigan, Ohio, and nearby states, the Detroit-Windsor corridor is essential to local manufacturing jobs. Automakers like Ford and General Motors rely heavily on the seamless movement of parts across that border. For Canada, the same corridor supports factories and suppliers that form part of the same industrial ecosystem. The two economies are so integrated that disruptions rarely affect only one side. If the flow of goods slows down, factories in both countries feel the consequences. And if political tensions escalate into trade restrictions, the economic damage would spread across the entire region. Some business groups and labor organizations in the United States have already expressed concern about the possibility of delays in opening the Gordie Howe Bridge. From their perspective, the new crossing is essential for strengthening supply chains and maintaining the competitiveness of North American manufacturing. Meanwhile, Canada's leadership appears to be pursuing a strategy focused on patience and leverage rather than confrontation. Prime Minister Carney, who previously served as the governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, has built a reputation for handling economic crises through careful strategic planning. Rather than responding to pressure with aggressive rhetoric, his approach seems to focus on highlighting Canada's own economic strengths, especially its role as a major energy supplier and trading partner. The message is subtle but clear. Canada intends to continue moving forward with its infrastructure projects, and it has options if the relationship becomes strained. That dynamic reflects a broader change in the global economy. For decades, many analysts assumed that the US-Canada relationship was so stable and integrated that major conflicts between the two countries were almost impossible. But events like this remind us that even long-standing partnerships require constant cooperation and negotiation. The question now is how the dispute will resolve. One possibility is that behind-the-scenes negotiations lead to a compromise. Political leaders on both sides could claim victory while allowing the bridge to open as originally planned. Another possibility is that tensions escalate further, triggering wider trade disputes that affect industries throughout North America. And a third possibility is that the situation becomes part of a broader shift in global economic relationships, with countries seeking new trade routes and partnerships to reduce dependence on any single partner. At the moment, the most likely outcome still appears to be a negotiated resolution. But the episode already reveals something important. Infrastructure projects like the Gordie Howe Bridge aren't just about transportation. They represent the physical foundations of international cooperation. When politics begins to interfere with those systems, the consequences can ripple through entire economies. And that's why a bridge between Detroit and Windsor has suddenly become a focal point in a much larger story about trade, power, and the future of North American relations. What do you think? Is this dispute just another political standoff that will fade once negotiations happen behind closed doors? Or does it signal deeper changes in the relationship between the United States and Canada? Share your thoughts.